reasons. For instance, Muslim sources report that Muhammad once delivered what are now called the Satanic verses to his followers. These verses promoted prayers to three pagan goddesses, Alat, Alusa, and Manat. Muhammad bowed down in honor of these polytheistic verses, and his followers bowed down with him. But a little later, Gabriel confronted Muhammad about his sin. Muhammad confessed in the History of At-Tabari, Volume 6, page 111, "I have fabricated things against God and have imputed to him words which he has not spoken." So Muhammad admitted that he delivered a revelation that didn't really come from God. Why is this important? Well, in Deuteronomy 18, verse 20, God declares, "But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death." Muslims claim that they respect Moses. But if Muhammad had delivered the Satanic verses during the time of Moses, Moses would have ordered the people to pick up stones and stone him to death as the most obvious false prophet in history. Muhammad didn't realize this due to his lack of familiarity with the Jewish scriptures, which is why the motto of Islam has always been and always will be, ignorance is bliss.
Faster than you can say mental hospitals disable dead kids and hammers, David Wood keeps bringing up already refuted stories or arguments against the Prophet Muhammad, and David Wood brings up the Satanic verses story where the Prophet Muhammad allegedly uttered verses from Satan instead of God in the Quran, chapter 53, verses 19 to 23. So let's see if the story is true or false according to Muslim scholars, both classical and early. Notice the first source David Wood cites is the History of al-Tabari. Now, I've already said this many times before on this channel, that al-Tabari warns people that his books are filled with inauthentic and authentic stories. In the History of al-Tabari, Volume 1, pages 171 to 172. In this story found in the History of al-Tabari is not reliable or authentic, which I'll get into right now. Ibn Ishaq is one of those narrators on whose authority the much debated story Satanic verses is related. In fact, he falls in the one of the chain of narrators for the alleged story given by al-Tabari. Now, notice al-Tabari's chain of transmission. He cites Ibn Ishaq as one of the narrators in the History of al-Tabari, Volume 6, page 108. The reference is right there. So what's the problem with Ibn Ishaq narrating the story? Let's get into it. By the logic employed by David Wood, Ibn Ishaq should have believed in the truth of this narration, since David Wood keeps saying, well, Ibn Ishaq, the History of al-Tabari, is early, and early Muslim scholars wrote down the Satanic verses story. However, we learned that Ibn Ishaq believed the story to be utter falsehood. Even the narrator in Tabari's source believed the Satanic verses story is false. So it goes back to the logic, which is the logic in Islamic studies or Hadith studies is just because something is early, it doesn't mean it's reliable. You have to have reliable narrators in order for a story in Islam to be authentic or inauthentic. In this case, the story is inauthentic because the narrator is not reliable. Abu Hayyan al-Andusuri mentions that about the story of the Satanic verses, Imam Muhammad ibn Ishaq, the compiler of Sirah is the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, was asked, he said this is a fabrication from the heretics, and he wrote a book on the issue. So, and this is found in Tafsir al-Baya al-Muhit, Volume 7, page 526. You can see the reference on the screen there. So Ibn Ishaq himself said that the story is a fabrication of the heretics, and he wrote a whole book on the issue. So even Ibn Ishaq declared the story to be false, and he wrote a book on why it's false, according to the early Muslim, or the Muslim scholar, classical Muslim scholar Abu Hayyan al-Andusuri. Not only did Ibn Ishaq say that the story is false, but classical and early Muslim scholars who were writing or were active during the time of Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari have looked into the sources for the Satanic verses story and have declared or concluded that the story is false or a fabrication based on there being unreliable narrators or liars in the chain of transmission for the story. So the people who are narrating the story in the chain of transmission were known to be liars or unreliable. So we have people who would fabricate, who would make up stories about the Prophet Muhammad, after his death to make Islam look bad for whatever reason, and they were unreliable narrators in the chain of transmission. So we can see that classical Muslim scholars and early Muslim scholars have rejected the story. Ibn Kathir says the story is inauthentic, and Ibn Kathir in his Tafsir, volume 5, page 441 to 442, Ibn Jawad said the story is not correct, and Zaad al-Muyassar, volume 4, page 391. When Ibn Khuzaimah was asked about it, he said this story is invented by the heretics in Tafsir al-Raazi, volume 11, page 134. Al-Shaukani said that the story is not proved correct by rules of reporting in Tafsir al-Raazi, volume 11, page 135. Imam Raazi said that the story is false in his Tafsir, volume 11, page 135. Ghazi Ayad said the story is not related in an authentic way by authentic reporters, shows its weakness. In al-Shafa, volume 2, page 125. You get my point, So these are all the Muslim scholars, early and classical Muslim scholars who have rejected the story, the Satanic verses story, because they looked into the chain of the narrators, and they said that the story is invented by heretics, and it didn't come down with a correct rules of reporting. There were no authentic reporters, etc., etc. So all these classical Muslim scholars gave reasons why the story is false. Like classical and important Muslim scholars like Ibn Kathir, etc., al-Raazi, etc. So the story was rejected even by classical or early Muslim scholars. They rejected the story. Two, they looked into the sources of the story, and the sources were unreliable according to the rules of hadith reporting. So even early Muslim scholars or classical Muslim scholars have rejected the story. So what is the conclusion here? The conclusion here is that the story is false, as Muslim scholars, both early and classical Muslim scholars, have declared. David Wood needs to seriously stop using this argument or this story, since it's been refuted hundreds of times by not only me, but other Muslim apologists like Shabir Ali have refuted, etc., have refuted the story. So David Wood needs to stop bringing up the story because it's false. And even if it was true, let's just say for the sake of argument it's true, it actually proves Muhammad is a prophet, because why did Angel Gabriel come later and correct Prophet Muhammad? If Prophet Muhammad was a false prophet influenced by Satan, why would God send Angel Gabriel to correct that revelation, or to overthrow or correct that satanic revelation? So even if the story is true, it proves Muhammad is a prophet, because why would God send Angel Gabriel to correct a false prophet's satanic revelation? You see, so even if this story is true, it proves Muhammad is a prophet, because Angel Gabriel came and corrected the Prophet Muhammad. That wouldn't have happened if Muhammad was satanically influenced to begin with. So regardless, the story is bullshit, it's false, and David Wood needs to seriously stop using it.